The sound of the machine was soft, almost polite, but it shattered her dignity louder than any scream ever could. It was just a small sound, a cold, indifferent refusal, a quiet signal that the last fragile thread holding her life together had snapped. She froze, her fingers still resting on the worn edge of the counter, her breath trapped somewhere between her lungs and her breaking heart. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, making everything feel harsher, more exposed. People stood behind her in line, shifting their weight, pretending not to watch, but watching anyway. Her groceries sat there, milk, bread, medicine, and a small box of cereal with bright cartoon stars on it. Nothing unnecessary, nothing extra, only survival. Her name was Margaret Hale, and at 63 years old, she had never felt smaller. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion from fighting a life that had stopped fighting for her. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet miracles that restore faith in humanity, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in good people, and subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Margaret had not always been invisible. There was a time when she had walked through life with purpose. She had been a school secretary for 32 years, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the last student had gone home. She knew every child's name, every teacher's birthday, every parent's worry. She had been the quiet heartbeat of a small school that no longer existed. Then the school closed. Then her husband died. Then everything else slowly followed. Grief had not arrived as a storm. It had come like winter, silent, gradual, stealing warmth piece by piece until she no longer remembered what warmth felt like. Her savings disappeared into hospital bills during her husband's final months. Her pension barely covered rent. Her pride prevented her from asking anyone for help. Her son had moved far away years ago, chasing a future she never wanted to hold back. She told him she was fine, even when she wasn't, especially when she wasn't. That morning, she had counted her money 3 times before leaving home. She had chosen the cheapest bread, the smallest milk. She had put back the apples, even though she loved apples. She had stood in the medicine aisle for 15 minutes before finally deciding she needed the cheaper, generic version. She had done everything right, everything careful, everything necessary. But life didn't care about careful. The cashier cleared her throat gently, her eyes full of quiet sympathy. Margaret saw it, that look people gave when they knew you were losing something you couldn't afford to lose. Margaret reached into her purse, her fingers searching for coins she already knew weren't there. Her chest tightened as shame wrapped itself around her ribs like iron wire. She wished she could disappear. She wished the floor would open and swallow her. She thought of her late husband, Daniel, and how he had always made her feel safe. He had worked construction for 40 years, his hands rough and strong, his love steady and quiet. He used to say they would grow old together without fear. But he hadn't grown old. He simply stopped. Margaret felt the tears rising, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of strangers. Her dignity was the last thing she owned. Behind her, someone shifted. A presence, still, calm. She didn't turn around. She didn't want witnesses. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to exist. She began to gather her things, preparing to leave behind the medicine she needed most. And that was when everything changed. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with something far more powerful. Kindness.
Margaret never saw his face at first. She only felt the moment change, like the air itself had softened. It was in the way the cashier paused, in the way the tension behind her disappeared, in the way something unseen stepped forward into her collapsing world. She heard movement, calm, certain, gentle. There was no hesitation in it, no performance, no demand for recognition, only intention. Margaret kept her eyes lowered, her heart pounding. She assumed it was nothing, another customer stepping closer, another silent witness to her quiet humiliation. But then she noticed something impossible. The cashier's expression shifted. Relief. Margaret didn't understand it. She blinked, confused, her fragile composure hanging by a thread. She felt the weight of her exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than any burden she had ever carried. She had lived carefully. She had endured loss without complaint. She had survived loneliness without bitterness. She had asked nothing from the world. And yet, the world had taken everything. Her home was small and cold now. The heater barely worked. At night, she wore 2 sweaters and still shivered. She had learned to move slowly, to conserve energy, to stretch every dollar, every moment, every hope. Some nights she sat in her chair by the window, staring at nothing, wondering how a life full of love could end in such quiet emptiness. She remembered Daniel's laugh, the way it filled rooms, the way it made her feel anchored to something permanent. She remembered holding his hand in the hospital, feeling it grow colder. She remembered the moment she realized she was alone. That moment had never ended. Until now. She felt something shift behind her. Not pressure, not judgment. Something warmer, something human. She didn't know why, but her chest tightened, not with shame this time, but with something unfamiliar. Safety. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She slowly lifted her eyes. The world hadn't changed. The store was still bright. The people were still strangers. Her life was still fragile. But something had entered her story. Someone had chosen to see her, not as a burden, not as a failure, but as a person worth saving. Margaret didn't fully understand what was happening, but she felt it, and sometimes feeling is enough. She gathered her groceries slowly, her hands still trembling, but not from shame anymore. Something else lived in her chest now, something fragile. Hope. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She wasn't ready to face whatever miracle had just touched her life, because miracles were dangerous. They made you believe again, and belief had hurt her before. She walked toward the exit, each step uncertain, as if she were learning how to walk again. Outside, the air was cold and honest. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight inside her shift. She had walked into that store feeling like her life was over. She walked out feeling like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. But the stranger wasn't finished with her story yet.
Margaret sat on the bus ride home, staring at her hands. They still trembled, not from weakness, from disbelief. All her life she had believed that people survived alone, that strength meant endurance, that asking for nothing meant losing nothing. But today, someone had given without asking. Someone had stepped into her darkness and lit a candle. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She only knew that for a moment she had mattered. That night she sat by her window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She held the box of medicine in her hands longer than necessary, as if it were something sacred. Because it was never about the medicine, it was about being seen. Days passed, but something inside Margaret had changed. She stood a little straighter. She walked a little slower, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. She began noticing things again, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of laughter in the distance, the quiet rhythm of life continuing. Kindness had done what time could not.
It had awakened her. One afternoon, she returned to the same store. Her heart raced as she stepped inside. She didn't know why she came. She didn't expect to see him, but she needed to stand in the place where her life had changed. She walked the aisles slowly, remembering the exact spot where she had almost broken forever. And then she saw him. He stood near the entrance, helping an elderly man reach something from a high shelf. He wasn't extraordinary. He was young, ordinary, quiet, but his eyes held something rare, compassion without condition. Margaret didn't approach him. She didn't need to, because she finally understood something she had forgotten. Kindness is not a transaction. It is a ripple. It moves outward, touching lives you may never see. That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote a letter to her son. Not to hide her pain, not to protect him from her truth, but to reconnect. Weeks later, her phone rang. Her son's voice was older, softer, full of regret and love. He had believed she was strong. He hadn't known she was alone. Within months, he came home. He fixed her heater. He filled her kitchen with warmth. He stayed. Margaret realized that the stranger hadn't just helped her buy groceries. He had given her back her life. So here is a special request. Before this story ends, comment the word kindness if you believe one small act can save someone's world, because it can, and it did. Margaret never forgot that day. She never forgot how close she had come to disappearing quietly into the background of a world that had no time for her. And she never forgot the stranger who refused to let her vanish. She began volunteering at a community center, helping others who felt invisible. She listened, she smiled, she gave what she could, because she knew now what kindness felt like. It felt like oxygen. Years later, she would still remember that moment, not as the day her pard declined, but as the day her faith returned. She never knew his full story, but she knew his impact, and sometimes that is enough. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to this channel. Because stories like Margaret's remind us that the world is not saved by grand gestures, but by ordinary people who choose to care. Margaret Hale had walked into that store, believing she was at the end of her story. She walked out, realizing she was only at the beginning. And somewhere out there, the stranger continued living his life, never fully knowing that his quiet decision had rescued not just a moment, but a soul.